Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned.
As kids, we all heard spooky stories that kept us up at night, but we could always find comfort in the idea that demons and supernatural beings weren't real. Well, in today's video, we're exploring 5 real-life accounts of demonic possession that might make you question that belief. The Exorcism of Roland Doe. It was January 1949, and a Washington, D.C. area home would soon become the stage for a supernatural horror that would inspire one of the most iconic films in cinema history, The Exorcist.
I would say that everything in the movie can actually happen because the devil will play on a person's memory and imagination.
The film was loosely based on 13-year-old Ronald Hunkeler, later known as Roland Doe, who had endured terrifying phenomena that no doctor or psychiatrist could explain. But it wasn't until they turned to the church that the full extent of the horror began to emerge, an ordeal that would unfold in a series of increasingly violent and inexplicable events. The Hunkeler family's home, located in a quiet DC suburb, seemed ordinary on the outside, but within its walls, an evil presence was brewing. The sounds began innocently enough. Faint scratching noises from behind the walls, the odd creak of the floorboards, and the soft drip of water with no discernible source. Yet these were the early rumblings of something much more unnerving. When Ronald's bed began to shake violently in the dead of night, his parents' disbelief turned to horror. By day, Ronald was a typical teenager, although he had recently become withdrawn and despondent over the death of his beloved Aunt Harriet, a spiritualist who had taught him how to use a Ouija board. But by night, the boy transformed. He erupted into terrifying fits, his body breaking out in scratches that seemed to appear without cause. Objects moved on their own. His bed slid across the room, and the very walls of his home seemed to whisper. Desperate, the Hunkelers sought help. Local ministers and doctors offered no answers, and their expertise couldn't explain the strange occurrences. Only after a Lutheran minister witnessed the bed shaking firsthand did the family turn to Jesuit priests in St. Louis. Among them was Father William Bodern, who would soon find himself face to face with what he believed was demonic possession. Father Bodern's first encounter with Ronald in the spring of 1949 was unsettling to say the least. Once calm during the day, the boy would convulse violently at night. As the priest attempted to pray over him, Ronald lashed out, spitting and cursing in guttural Latin, a language he had no knowledge of. Scratches appeared on his skin, and at one point the word Louis scrawled itself into his flesh, prompting the family to relocate to St. Louis, where they had relatives. It was there, in the colonial-style house on Roanoke Drive, that the true battle began. The exorcisms, led by Bodern and fellow priest Father Walter Halloran, spanned weeks. Every night, as they performed the rites, they were met with terrifying resistance. Ronald would thrash and scream, his voice no longer his own. Sacred objects caused him to recoil violently, and red, jagged lines would snake across his body as if clawed by an unseen hand. On March 20th, things escalated. Ronald urinated all over his bed and began shouting obscenities at the priests. His parents, exhausted and terrified, rushed him to Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis for further treatment. The final confrontation occurred on the night of April 18, 1949. Bodern, Halloran, and their team laid holy relics on the boy's body, calling upon St. Michael to drive out the demon. The room erupted with chaotic energy. Ronald convulsed violently before falling eerily still. Then, in a voice deeper than his own, he proclaimed, "He's gone." The aftermath was as sudden as it was serene. The teenager, once a thrashing, snarling figure, became calm. He later told the priests that he had seen a vision, St. Michael standing before him with a flaming sword, vanquishing the demon. The exorcists were relieved, but the ordeal had left its mark on Roland and everyone involved. Ronald went on to live a seemingly normal life. His name was changed to protect his privacy. He would eventually marry and have children, leaving the horrors of his youth behind. The house on Roanoke Drive, now infamous, was later sold to unsuspecting owners, its dark history buried beneath the picturesque exterior. While the true story of Roland Doe's exorcism may never be fully known, the chilling events of 1949 remain one of the most well-documented cases of possession in modern history. But as with all such stories, the line between truth and myth blurs, leaving us to wonder where the real horror lies, in the mind of a troubled boy or the forces of demonic possession that may have claimed him. The Exorcism of Maricica Irina Cornici. In the stillness of a remote Romanian monastery, the sound of rain tapping on a tin roof echoed through the hills. Inside, Maricica Irina Cornici, a young nun, lay bound to a crude wooden cross, her body weakened after days without food or water. The last of her breaths faltered beneath a gag as the exorcists around her continued their ritual, convinced they were battling the devil himself. By the time they called for an ambulance, it was already too late. The Holy Trinity Monastery stood atop the rolling hills of Târnacu, Romania. It was a modest structure with stone walls and a metal roof, isolated from the rest of the world. It was a place meant for spiritual revival, where the devout sought refuge from a harsh world. The surrounding vineyards stretched toward the horizon, but inside the convent, shadows of superstition lingered beneath its holy veneer. Maricica Irina Cornici had come here in 2005, a 23-year-old woman fleeing a life marred by tragedy. Born in 1982, her father's suicide had cast a long shadow on her childhood, and her mother, drowning in alcoholism, abandoned her at the Barlad Children's Home. There, Cornici endured years of abuse. By the time she was released in 2001, her fragile mental state had already begun to deteriorate. But those around her, including the clergy at the monastery, would come to believe she was afflicted not by illness, but by something far more scary. By the time Cornici arrived at the Holy Trinity Monastery in April of 2005, her descent into paranoia had already begun. Her mind, ravaged by schizophrenia, convinced her that demonic voices whispered in the darkness. "The devil is speaking to me," she confided to a psychiatrist at the Vaslui Hospital, where she was briefly treated. Local doctors diagnosed her condition as schizophrenia, her first episode. But the doctor's diagnosis held little weight within the monastery. Father Daniel Petre Corigianu, the red-bearded priest who presided over the isolated convent, believed otherwise. To him, Cornici's erratic behavior, her sudden outbursts, her violent fits, were unmistakable signs of possession. The devil had taken hold of her, he claimed, and it was up to him and his faithful nuns to expel the demon from her soul. She refused to drink the holy water, Father Corigianu told reporters later. In his mind, her resistance was proof of the devil's hold. Even Cornici's own brother believed the monastery's explanation. He had witnessed something terrifying in her eyes, he told family members, when the devil had entered her during her first communion. Inside the convent, Cornici's mental state worsened. She became violent, lashing out during prayers, her screams echoing through the monastery halls. After a brief hospital stay, she returned to the monastery, her fate sealed by the superstitions that governed the secluded religious community. On a gray, unremarkable day in June, Father Corigianu decided it was time to banish the demons. With 4 nuns standing by, he ordered Cornici shackled to a wooden cross. The nuns bound her wrists and ankles, gagging her with a towel to silence her screams. They prayed over her, invoking the name of God, splashing holy water on her parched lips. "In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ," Father Corigianu intoned, "I command you, devil, leave this woman." The ritual stretched on for 3 agonizing days. As Cornici's strength gave away, her lips cracked from dehydration. The makeshift cross dug into her flesh. The holy water meant to save her only soaked her weakening body. Father Corigianu and the nuns remained vigilant, refusing to end the exorcism until the devil was banished. But after 3 days, Cornici's condition had become impossible to ignore. She was no longer struggling. no longer screaming. Finally, someone in the monastery came to their senses and called for an ambulance. When help arrived, it was already too late. Cornici was dead, her body ravaged by dehydration and suffocation. The marks from her bindings, on her wrists, her ankles, her neck, were unmistakable. Her aunt, who identified the body, could barely recognize her niece. She was disfigured, she later recalled, her voice breaking. It was too cruel. God, much too cruel. The news of Cornici's death reverberated through Romania, a country where superstition and religious devotion had long been intertwined. Public outrage followed swiftly, and the Orthodox Church distanced itself from the scandal. The Holy Trinity Monastery was shuttered, its gates chained, and Father Corregianu was defrocked. But even as he faced charges of aggravated murder alongside the 4 nuns, the priest remained unrepentant. God has performed a miracle for her, he said. At last, Irina has been delivered from evil. Romania's most trusted institution, the Orthodox Church, condemned the exorcism as abominable. Polls showed the country's deep trust in its religious leaders, but this tragic case forced a reckoning. Cornici's death was not just the result of one man's fanaticism, but of an entire community's willingness to place blind faith in the ancient rituals of possession. Father Corregianu was sentenced to 14 years in prison, and the 4 nuns each received varying terms for their roles in the death of Maricica Cornici. But for many in Romania, the trial did little to exorcise the darker forces at play in the nation's rural corners, where mental illness was still too often viewed through the lens of the supernatural. In Cornici's native village of Perieni, her grave is marked with a simple wooden cross, her name scrawled in black ink, Sister Irina. Her tragic death stands as a somber reminder of what happens when the boundaries between faith and fear are blurred, and when the search for spiritual salvation becomes indistinguishable from human suffering. The Demons of Anna Ecklund. In the sweltering heat of a summer evening in 1928, Father Theophilus Riesinger, a bespectacled, aging priest, found himself behind the wheel of an overheating car. The 500-person town of Erling, Iowa, was little more than a dot on the map. Yet, it was about to become the epicenter of an unimaginable battle between good and evil. Father Theophilus had been called to perform what would soon become one of the most infamous exorcisms of the 20th century. As the priest made his way to the train station, where a woman named Anna Ecklund awaited him, his vehicle sputtered and stalled, a sinister omen of what was about to come. But when he arrived late, Anna was calm. "I would have been much more surprised if everything had gone smoothly," she remarked. "The devil will try his utmost to foil our plans." Born around 1882, Anna Ecklund, or perhaps Emma Schmidt, had once been an ordinary girl raised in a devoutly Catholic household in rural Wisconsin. By age 14, her life had changed in ways beyond her control. Menacing voices whispered in her ears, her prayers were choked back, and she became unable to cross the threshold of the church she had always known. Her body rebelled against her will, an unseen force keeping her from Holy Communion. Her father, Jacob, had long since died, but his shadow loomed dark over her life. A life of sexual abuse and spiritual torment had allegedly opened the door to something far worse. In the following years, Anna was described as understanding languages she had never studied, including Latin, Hebrew, and Polish. Her once innocent features would twist into violent, contorted expressions, and when blessed by a priest, her lips would foam, and her wild eyes would radiate sheer hatred. Physicians, baffled, found nothing wrong with her physically or mentally, but the inexplicable horrors continued. It was then that her family turned to the church. Father Theophilus Riesinger had encountered many such cases before, but none like this. Ecklund's possession spanned years, and the demons that tormented her seemed stronger than any he had faced before. On June 12, 1908, he performed his first exorcism on her, but the relief was fleeting. The demons soon returned, and they brought even more torment with them. By 1928, Ecklund's condition had reached its most horrifying peak. It was then that Riesinger, with the blessing of his bishop, arranged for her to be transported to the small Franciscan convent in Erling. What awaited them there was beyond human understanding. When Riesinger began the exorcism prayers, the air seemed to thicken. Ecklund, restrained by the strongest nuns in the convent, thrashed with superhuman strength. Suddenly, her body broke free from her bonds. Her frail frame hurled itself through the air, high above the door of the room, clinging to the wall with the agility of a wild animal. A collective gasp echoed through the room, except for Riesinger, who continued his prayers unperturbed. The exorcism stretched for days, then weeks. The demons inside Ecklund were many. There was Beelzebub, whose guttural voice barked in Latin, German, and English. And then there was the voice of her own father, Jacob, who, it was claimed, had cursed her from beyond the grave after a lifetime of sexual abuse. The smell of excrement filled the room as Ecklund vomited copious amounts of bile and other fluids, more than her body could naturally hold. As Father Theophilus relentlessly prayed over the possessed woman, the demons within her retaliated, twisting her face into grotesque shapes. Her eyes bulged from their sockets, and her skin turned the color of glowing embers. Her body swelled to unnatural proportions, as though it would burst. At one point, her lips swelled to the size of hands, and her limbs, once emaciated, puffed up grotesquely, striking fear even in the hearts of the most devout nuns. But on the 23rd day, something shifted. Anna Ecklund, who had been unconscious for much of the ordeal, suddenly opened her eyes. With her lips barely moving, she smiled, a smile that had been absent for over a decade, and cried out, "My Jesus, mercy! Praised be Jesus Christ!" The demonic voices that had filled the room, taunting and mocking for days, were suddenly silenced. The exorcism had seemingly succeeded. The cacophony of demonic voices had faded into the distance, and the quiet that followed was almost too peaceful. Anna collapsed back onto the bed, her body finally at rest. But as Riesinger knelt beside her, his face etched with exhaustion, he knew the battle wasn't truly over. Despite this moment of triumph, Anna's fate remained uncertain. In the years that followed, Anna Ecklund, now free from possession, lived in relative obscurity. Yet rumors persisted that the demons had never truly left her. Periodic relapses plagued her, and Father Riesinger continued to minister to her as best he could. His last words on the matter, spoken in an interview years later, were chilling. "This case will continue until Christ says it is enough." The 1928 exorcism of Anna Ecklund remains one of the most disturbing accounts of possession ever recorded. Yet, in many ways, it has become a defining case in the Catholic understanding of demonic affliction. Though celebrated for his dedication, Father Theophilus Riesinger was haunted by the case for the rest of his life, believing that each exorcism of Anna banished legions of demons. Although, it seems, never quite permanently. The Exorcism of Gottliebin Dittus. In the autumn of 1840, in the small German town of Möttlingen, the Dittus family moved into a modest, weather-worn apartment. The creaking and banging of the house seemed typical of an old, dilapidated structure. But it wasn't long before the house revealed a more sinister character. It wasn't just the home groaning from its foundations. The eerie sounds came from every corner, and the disturbances persisted long into the night. Among the 5 Dittus siblings, one became the focus of a horrifying ordeal. Gottliebin, the youngest sister, known for her fervent faith and pious demeanor, was soon found writhing on the floor in convulsions, as if something dark had taken hold of her. The town of Möttlingen, nestled in the rolling hills of Germany, was quiet and unassuming, much like the Dittus family. They were poor, having recently been orphaned, and struggled to make ends meet. Their apartment was a somber place, dull and cold, with the kind of atmosphere that weighed heavy on the soul. The eldest brother, Andreas, a hard-working and practical man, did his best to hold the family together. But his younger sister, Gottliebin, soon became a source of growing concern. She was a devout young woman known in the town for her intense faith and solemn nature. But not long after the family moved in, something began to change in her. It started with fainting spells and convulsions, first dismissed as illness, but soon escalated into a nightmare that engulfed the entire family. The peculiar occurrences in the Dittus household intensified over the next year. Strange lights flickered across the walls at night, and heavy footsteps seemed to follow Gottliebin wherever she went. She claimed to see the ghost of a woman she had once known from the village standing silently by her bed, cradling a dead child in her arms. "Leave me alone," the specter would whisper, her voice full of torment. The family was terrified, but the villagers, already wary of the Dittus siblings, grew suspicious and kept their distance. Even Johann Christoph Blumhardt, the town's Lutheran pastor, was hesitant to intervene despite his position as a spiritual leader. Blumhardt's first encounters with Gottliebin were unsettling. He visited her when she was stricken with an illness that left her face swollen and disfigured. But each time he entered the room, she avoided his gaze, twisting her head to the side and resisting his prayers. What had once been a deeply faithful girl now seemed to repel all that was holy. The pastor, uncomfortable and disturbed by her behavior, quickly left, leaving Gottliebin to endure her torment alone. As months passed, the phenomena worsened. Doors would open silently on their own, tables shook violently in her presence, and the house was filled with an oppressive force that suffocated all who entered. Blumhardt finally returned to investigate, compelled by the growing terror of the situation. He searched the apartment with local authorities, discovering mysterious objects buried beneath the floorboards, coins wrapped in soot-stained paper, bones, and other remnants of what seemed to be satanic rituals. These discoveries only deepened the sense of dread surrounding Gottliebin, as if the house itself was cursed. During the next 2 years, Gottliebin's suffering had reached unimaginable levels. She was no longer merely ill or afflicted. She was possessed. Blumhardt, reluctantly drawn deeper into the mystery, began to witness the full extent of her torment. During one particularly violent episode, her body twisted unnaturally, her mouth foaming as her eyes rolled back into her head. Her voice, deep, guttural, and foreign, erupted with rage. "I cannot stand to hear that name," she snarled when Blumhardt invoked Jesus Christ. The pastor had suspected possession before, but now he was certain. He had no choice but to confront the evil head-on. In the coming months, Gottliebin was ravaged by her possessions. The demons within her multiplied. At first, there were 14, but soon their numbers grew to an astonishing 425, and later, horrifyingly, over 1,000. Each demon seemed bent on destroying her. She began to vomit up strange objects, shards of glass, nails, and even live creatures like frogs and bats. Seeing these events firsthand, Blumhardt was horrified, yet determined to save her. He spent hours at her bedside, praying fiercely as she writhed and screamed, her body contorting into grotesque shapes. The demonic presence spread through the family, with Gottliebin's sister, Katharina, and her half-blind brother, Hans, also falling under its influence. Usually mild-mannered, Katharina had to be restrained as she flew into violent fits, threatening to tear Blumhardt apart. During one of these frenzied nights, in December 1843, the climactic confrontation occurred. Katharina, possessed by what called itself an angel of Satan, roared in fury, but as the clock struck midnight, Blumhardt's prayers reached a crescendo. Suddenly, the demon's voice broke, and Katharina, her body bent backward over a chair, screamed out, "Jesus is victor!" The room fell silent. The oppressive force that had held the family in its grip for years was finally broken. After that night, the Dittus family slowly returned to normalcy, but the scars of their ordeal remained. Blumhardt's role in the exorcism became a matter of local legend, and he chronicled the events in a detailed report outlining the horrors that had taken place. Gottliebin, once a vessel for unspeakable evil, emerged free from her torment, though weakened by the ordeal. The demons, which had once seemed undefeatable, were banished, and the village of Möttlingen slowly forgot the horrors that had transpired within the Dittus household. Though Gottliebin Dittus went on to live a quiet, uneventful life, the memory of her possession lingered in the town. For Blumhardt, the exorcism was not just a victory over demonic forces, but a testament to the power of faith. "Jesus is victor," he would say, repeating the words that had finally freed the Dittus family from the grip of such unrepentant evil. The Haunting of Amy Stamatis. On a crisp November day in 2006, in the quiet town of Searcy, Arkansas, Amy Stamatis jumped from the second-story window of her home. The fall left her paralyzed below the waist, but her real torment had begun months before. As she lay in her hospital bed, her body broken, her mind raged against internal forces she couldn't explain. That's when Cindy Lawson, a Pentecostal evangelist, appeared by her bedside. Lawson claimed to have performed 10 real-life exorcisms and believed she knew the cause of Stamatis' suffering: demons. "The Lord spoke to me and told me to go to the hospital to cast the demons out of her," Lawson later recounted. "I could feel something churning." The seeds of Amy Stamatis' nightmare were planted in the most mundane of settings, a hospital shift. As a seasoned nurse at Baptist Health Medical Center in Little Rock, Amy had finished writing a report when something inside her snapped. She suddenly forgot how to do her job. It was as if the very skills that had defined her career had evaporated overnight. Confused and terrified, she resigned. A lifelong runner, Stamatis soon found she couldn't run either. It was as if her legs betrayed her as her mind unraveled. Doctors diagnosed her with depression, prescribing antidepressants, but her condition only worsened. The once vibrant woman became erratic, disrobing in public without explanation, screaming at friends in fits of hysteria. Then came the voices, disembodied whispers urging her to end her life. They plagued her day and night, growing more insistent with each passing month. One day, they led her to the top of a 7-story parking ramp, where she stood on the edge, ready to jump. Fortunately, the police arrived just in time, talking her down from what could have been her final act. But the voices persisted. By November, they had driven her to a desperate conclusion. She climbed to the second floor of her home and leaped. When she woke up paralyzed in a hospital bed, the voices still hadn't left her. That's when Cindy Lawson enters the picture, a woman who claimed to possess divine power. Lawson's path to becoming an exorcist had been paved with extraordinary experiences that seemed pulled from the pages of fiction. Her first exorcism, she said, was on a 9-year-old boy who levitated before her eyes during the ritual. She described subjects whose eyes would change color mid-exorcism, who would foam at the mouth and speak in guttural voices that could not have been their own. She found the work terrifying, but it was a calling she couldn't ignore. When Lawson arrived at Stamatis' bedside, she did so with conviction. The medical world had failed Amy. Her psychiatrist's treatments were powerless against the demons tormenting her. "In the medical world, they need to put a name to it," Stamatis would later say. "They don't understand because they have never dealt with these types of demons. The exorcism itself is a moment that Stamatis cannot recall, a void in her memory as black as the forces that had gripped her." But her family, who stood by during the ritual, spoke of an immediate and profound change in her demeanor. Whatever dark presence had been inhabiting her had, they believed, been driven out. Stamatis, for the first time in months, felt peace. Her body, however, remained paralyzed. Still, Cindy Lawson believes that God is still not done with Amy. In time, she says, God will restore her body as it did her spirit. The strange case of Amy Stamatis lies at the uneasy intersection of faith and medicine, of psychiatry and the supernatural. For 7 months, the voices had haunted her, suggesting that no drug, no doctor could offer relief. It took a leap of faith, both literal and spiritual, to bring her back from the edge. Yet the lingering question remains: what truly tormented Amy Stamatis? Was it an undiagnosed mental illness or, as Cindy Lawson insists, something far darker? As Amy lies in her bed, paralyzed but free of the voices, she continues to hope for a miracle. For her and for Lawson, the battle is not yet over, and they await the day when she might rise again, not just in spirit, but in body. So what do you make of these tales of demonic possession? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments section below. And if you made it this far, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again, and I hope to see you next time.